So I think let's kick off. We're privileged to have Geoffrey Robertson giving us the keynote address. So we'll hear from him first, and then I'll go to the panel. Geoffrey?
I can be brief for those of you who attended the last panel. There is no law protecting democracy. If there is a coup, then there will be a treason charge against the unsuccessful coup plotters, or if they are successful, then they will use treason, no doubt, against their opponents. But our friend Mr. Kara-Murza was sentenced to 25 years in a gulag in Siberia for treason. So treason does not depend on the democracy at all. It is there as a law to protect the existing government, whatever it is. And so there's no, while treason is used, and sedition, and there are various laws that can be used in America against the January the 9th hooligans. But every country has laws that can be used against those who wish to overthrow the government, or indeed by the overthrown government. So, as I said this morning, in international law, there is no protection for democracy. United Nations doesn't mention it in its charter. The international courts have not, to my knowledge, and anyone can show that they have, I'd be delighted to hear, but the only decision about democracy was made by an international court in 2000 in relation to one of the many coups, military coup, in Fiji. It came about because the Fiji constitution had erected this international court of 7 judges from New Guinea and various other islands of the Pacific, including Australia and New Zealand, and that court ruled, as a matter of international law, that a democracy that was overthrown, the overthrow of a democracy, was unlawful unless those who overthrew it could show that they had popular acceptance. And in that case they didn't. We called a lot of civic society representatives, churches and so forth, who said they were dismayed at the military takeover, and the court ruled that it was unlawful, illegal, and the government resigned. Remarkably enough, governments don't normally do that, no matter how much they're described as unlawful. But how to protect democracy is a serious matter. There have been 7 military coups in Africa over the last 2 years, and of course no remedy. So we can look, as I did last session, at the 3 great virtues of democracy and see how to protect them. Election rigging, ballot rigging, is something that is generally illegal, but of course it's the problem of getting evidence, and it's open to any faction, as ex-President Trump showed after the earlier election. He simply couldn't prove it, but there are generally laws that will allow it. Romania has been a recent example. Freedom of speech, the other important attribute of democracy, has usually some protection under constitutions, but that too is vulnerable. There are a lot of questions in the other panel that was on social media, which is running at the same time as this, on whether hate speech should be stopped. Those who support freedom of speech will usually make an exception for hate speech, certainly when it gets to incitement to violence. And then we have the independence of the judiciary, which was of particular concern. In the last panel we had a Turkish judge and a Hungarian judge who'd both suffered from governmental interference, governmental direction, governmental getting rid of them by the simple expedient of lowering the age for judicial service to 62 from 75. So that's indeed the weakest part of the democratic construct, and we need to think more about how to protect the independence of the judges. We've seen in America how reporting on the courts now requires almost you to say who appointed the judge who's hearing the case. If it's a Trump appointment, it's likely to be decided for the government. If it's not, then it's likely to be decided fairly. So they are the issues that we should look at.
Right. Thank you, Geoffrey. I think we'll go through the panels in the order in which they appear in the programme. So I'll start with you, President Marzouki.
Yeah. When we talk about crime against democracy, we always have think about repression, violence against human rights activists, erosion of rule of law, suppression of civil liberties, etc., etc. But I would like to share with you some thought about the most interesting phenomena I have seen in my life as a Democrat. You probably know that I have been in charge in Tunisia. I was president of Tunisia during a short period of time after the Arab Spring from 2011 2014. At the time, we were very, very optimistic. We were sure that we are going to have the most beautiful democracy in the Arab region, etc., etc. But what I have discovered at that time is how quickly and how skillfully, the journalists of the ancient regime used the freedom of expression that we have fought for it decades and paid a high price. How skillfully and how quickly they used it, to attack democracy, to attack the Democrats, and to attack the whole process. And I was also stunned to see how skillfully and how quickly the corrupt bourgeoisie, they very, very easily and very without no problem, they have organized themselves. They have organized political parties. In fact, they were not political parties. They have nothing to do with politics. They were something like, a mafia, a group of mafia. But the main problem is that, in fact, because they have the control of the media, because they have the control of the money, etc., etc., and because we gave them fair and transparent election, we lost this election. Because when you have this period of time between the revolution and the beginning of what I would call the rebirth of the society, you have an instability, an important instability. Economy is not going to grow because you lack everything. So the people waiting for you for everything, after revolution, the level of expectation is so high. So when you go to the elections, because this level of expectation that you can meet, and because of this corrupt media, because this corrupt people, etc., you lose power. And then you have the comeback of the anti-democrats. This is what's happening. Now in Tunisia, we have dictatorship, and this dictatorship came back to the government because of the very tool of democracy. And this is for me, the most important danger for democracy, that anti-democrats, populists now, they can use the very tool of democracy to destroy democracy. And we have to think about this new phenomena because it's the most important thing. What we are seeing in many, many countries, that populists are coming to power by the means of democracy. So the question for me, and I think the question for everybody, is how to protect the very tools of democracy not to be used against democracy. If you have a solution, please give me the solution, because I don't have any for the moment. Thank you.
Well, it strikes me, in the previous panel, we were talking about democracies breaking down because of lack of independence of the judiciary as the prime example. We're moving a little bit, and I think it's important in this panel, to building democracies. And how do you take into account democracy from when you're starting, in some cases, from scratch? And we're fortunate, I think, Fernando Traversi is an expert in building democracies. He's been involved for many years with societies in transition. So, Fernando, we'd like to get your perspective on it.
I will not be able to respond to the question, but just put in some ideas. Thank you, first of all. Some ideas that I would put on the table. When we were talking about, on the questions about the crime against democracy, I was thinking about very many different scenarios to think about it. One is when the crime is committed on the spot, when we're talking about an extrajudicial killing versus poisoning. When the crime happens like in a coup d'etat, or when it's poisoning, it happens little by little, day by day, before our eyes. And very different when it's like an aggression and a foreign attack or a coup d'etat, and when the democracy is being eroded from the inside and from the top. And that gives us a lot of different scenarios where we need to think, and probably the answers are very different. And when another question of the elements of the crime, they've been mentioned here: the independence of judiciary, the freedom of expression, the protection of minorities, the elections. And I was trying to understand in the different scenarios how those play in, among them, so we can protect them and react. Of course, I don't have an answer, but there were some thoughts that I want to put on the table when it's mentioned the international protection of democracy. And here, my background is on international law more than criminal law. Mm-hmm. So I'm immediately thinking or putting the lens of international relations, political dynamics, because on international public law, we always face the problem of enforcement. Who has the enforcement of the international public law beyond the political will of the states? Mm-hmm. And then in these times we live, problematic and very troubled, I wonder whether we have international political will to create new tools, as noble as the cause is, and endorsing what has been said. I wonder if the international community lives in a moment where we could build a consensus, a minimum consensus, to create a tool to protect democracy from the international level. When we witness, tragically, the lack of respect of international humanitarian law, IHL is basically in a graveyard today, challenges to the ICC, contempt to decisions. So sometimes I feel a bit anxious about proliferation of international instruments that we will not be able to enforce, because I think that fires back in a way that undermines the credibility. And I was also thinking, I think it's a great idea. I was just thinking about the risk, to put them on the table, just thinking like, oh, if we were able to do this, what the risk would be, what the impact would be. And I was thinking, in this world moment that we have, I thought this, a crime against democracy component, an element that we can prosecute, and I don't know if it would be able to be dealt from a criminal prosecution perspective. I think it could be misunderstood or understood as a neo-colonization thing from the west from the north to the south, right? Like imposing a political regime, because democracy is different in different countries. And then I think it would immediately bring back resistance by saying, wait a second, we don't have a very democratic international system that is being questioned at the UN because is not representative, there is no distribution of powers unequal. So, and that's been brought up very much in the last years. The Pact for the Future that it was adopted in the last General Assembly clearly says our international system needs to be reformed because it needs to be more democratic. So then I was thinking, how can we do, right? If it is a rebuilding or building democracy after war or dictatorship, we have all the transitional justice approach to seek the maximum possible of criminal accountability for those who has the greatest responsibility. Working with community societies for the right to truth, meaningful reparations, participation, and the whole system of reforming the state, constitution, electoral commissions, legal, security forces, police, judges, to reform that in order to come back to these principles. When it's happening before our eyes, I think in order to prevent the risk that I just mentioned, I think we really need to be better at fighting impunity on the actions that undermine and smash democracy, which usually come from very anti-democratic countries or anti-democratic leaderships. And usually we are, we struggled and we all work here towards that, but sometimes it's more difficult than we would like. So I think all those actions, concrete actions that really undermine democracy are the ones who should be subjected to the most efforts at the international level. I think at the national level, and I finish with this, which is where democracy can be protected within. I loved the intervention of the Prime Minister of Moldova. I think she was great when she basically said, how I understood it, democracy would not exist without cultural endorsement. If you have the institutions, if you have the legal frameworks, it will not exist if the culture, the society does not endorse it and defend it. And that is something that a law cannot make. That's very much a political, social, legal, and political. It's a combination of all of them. And I think in countries that are under attack now, and I think that revalorization of the values and principles for democracy that in many constitutions are already enshrined there, I think it's a cultural fight. I was about to say battle, and I don't want to use that. A cultural fight, a cultural struggle to revitalize that. And also something in transitional justice happens after war or dictatorship. You have to give value to those principles so you can restore the legitimacy of the institutions and the trust between the citizens and the institutions and among the citizens themselves. So that's what I would say for now.
Thank you very much, Fernando. I suppose to have a crime against democracy, you have to have a democracy. Read Brody has been hunting autocratic dictators who abuse people's human rights. How do you feel about crimes against democracy, Reed?
Well, I want to take up something. Sorry, that Geoffrey said. You talked about international courts. You talked about coups. I actually have the privilege of representing the ousted, detained president of Niger, Mohamed Bazoum. Niger is a member of ECOWAS. ECOWAS actually, in its charter, requires states to preserve the constitutional order. And we brought a case on behalf of President Bazoum to the ECOWAS Court of Justice, arguing that he'd been arbitrarily detained, but also that he had been unconstitutionally overthrown. And we won. The ECOWAS Court of Justice ordered that he be released, and actually that he be reinstated as president. He hasn't been, which shows you how far that ran. So there is another international case. And then Fernando talked about impunity, and as an American, I mean, everything we're living today, I mean, there are many reasons why we're living it, but one of the reasons is because Trump got away with trying to overthrow the government. I don't have to explain here that January 6th was an illegal insurrection. The Democrats were so, and this is what you talk about how sometimes the rule of law works against you, but the President Biden appointed an attorney general who was so mealy and so timid that for 2 years he didn't start any prosecution based on that. And by the time he appointed a special counsel, Trump was able to run out the clock. The U.S. Constitution, as probably many people know by now, in the 14th Amendment says that somebody who is involved in an insurrection cannot be President of the United States. It's very clear. And he is President, you may have noticed, of the United States. And now and you, Geoffrey, you talked about a coup. I believe we are living a coup in the United States. The President of the United States is dismantling agencies that Congress authorized. He's not spending money that Congress authorized. We saw yesterday, for the first time clearly, the President of the United States not respecting judicial orders. The Vice President has tweeted that judges cannot restrain the legitimate powers of the President. We are living a coup in the United States. It's obviously the judiciary is the most, the usurpation of judicial, or the lack of respect of judicial power and the usurpation of congressional power are the most evident. But we're seeing a total dismantling of academic freedom. J.D. Vance said professors are the enemy. President Trump has said that money will not go to colleges and universities that allow illegal demonstrations. I don't know what an illegal demonstration is in the United States of America. But obviously, and Columbia University, as you will have known, which had totally, by the way, capitulated to in terms of demonstrations and anti-Semitism, had $400 million of grants, taken away. This. I was watching Fareed Zakaria the other day, who said, this is America's universities and higher education are they're very expensive, but they're also, anybody in the world would want to go to American universities. And yet, this is really part of an attack on academic freedom. And grants are being cut. We heard that from a scientist this morning. And this is like the Cultural Revolution. They are taking learning and all the things that could potentially make America great again, and just eviscerating them to go back to yes sir. And we're seeing. I taught at Columbia Law. I went to Columbia Law. A professor of mine has already been kicked out several months ago. A friend of mine who's a professor was kicked out several months ago because she denounced attacks on Palestinian students on campus. And as you will know, last week, the Secretary of State arrested a protester, a peaceful protester, a lawful permanent resident who is now sitting in a jail in Louisiana. Certainly, a court will order that he be released and that he not be deported. We'll see if he gets deported. So I really think we're in the midst of a very serious situation. And I call on all of you who are not Americans to do, I heard at the end of the panel, to boycott America, to sanction America, to stand up to America, because we need you. And I have to say, in Europe, it's very heartwarming to see, even the conservative parties in Germany and France call this out for what it is. So.
Thank you, Ray. It's very depressing. Hope you give us some hope.
I'm going to do my best. So kind of to take it back to the basic, what I do with my organization is we support survivors of international crimes and core human rights violations, mainly committed by these governments, or undemocratic, at least, governments that we're talking about. And I think, when I was invited to this panel, I was kind of thinking about, what is our work? What is the crime against democracy? And I really came to the conclusion that exactly what we're doing is supporting and upholding the democracy, right? If we're talking about accountability, access to justice is a really big thing. So we provide legal aid for these survivors, mental health support, but also just making sure that they have access to, and we're very small, so we focus on the Netherlands, so not a bad country to be in, but there needs to be the access there. And what we also do is we uphold the rule of law also towards our own governments. Like if we don't do that already now in governments that are doing well, then we're gonna go towards the US. We already have a crazy right-wing government, which is absolutely horrifying. But I think this is also a call to action for, to support civil society organizations doing the strategic litigation, academics and the work that they're doing, but also the legal community. If you're looking at the States, I'm not sure how correct I am in what I read, but I understood that the Trump administration is also targeting the lawyers that were prosecuting him. Yes. Like, what are we talking about? This is crazy. And for me, that is a core crime against democracy, because these are the people that are upholding our constitutional rights and our access to justice. So I think in terms of, one of the questions that was in the panel, like, what can civil society do, is just keep doing this. Supporting the community, supporting the survivors, making sure that there is access in one way or another. Sometimes we need to be very creative. We also work on Gaza, so we're very creative sometimes. But keep pushing, and yeah, maybe to end with that, and have hope and continue. Because if that falls away, civil society and the people in being able to push forward, then yeah, I think we're all gonna lose.
Thank you very much. Stephen, over to you.
Okay. Well, let me take this back to the question about crimes against democracy and what's possible. I have a career as a prosecutor, 8 years as a United States Attorney, Chief Federal Prosecutor in my home district, and then 9 years at international tribunals. And of course, if you're going to write a criminal law, it can't be vague. Quite often, you can find in the laws that are there already ways to attack some of these crimes. But this idea of governments being overthrown or coup d'état, and whether that's an international crime, reminds me, I was in Addis Ababa last week and met for the second time with Hager Goldick. I don't know if you know President Marzouki, a fellow Tunisian, a very earnest attorney, very good international lawyer, and a very impossible job. And we got on the question of the Malabo Protocol. I'm sure Richard's familiar with it, but about 10 years ago, really as an effort, I think, to undermine the ICC, at Malabo, the African Union's heads of state adopted a protocol for potential ratification that listed a series of international crimes. Now, they exempted national leaders and key other leaders, et cetera, so that was a real hole in it from a complementarity standpoint. But it included the international crimes in the Rome Statute, also a lot of transnational crimes, trafficking in persons, trafficking in drugs, counterterrorism, all of that's in there. But also they had one called unconstitutional changes of government, and made it a crime, but they didn't define it. And I said, how are you coming on this definition? And they haven't. But frankly, it is an issue to try to work with the African Union on, because African Union, unlike the United Nations, has generally taken the position that they won't recognize a junta. Even if there's been overthrow and a transitional government, I remember visiting President Samba Panza in Car in Banjul, the crisis in 2014. She was an interim president, and I said, "Will you be at the AU next week?" And she says, "No, I can't come, because I'm not duly elected. I'm a successor to a junta, and it's only when we have an election that will be represented." So there is some effort, even though, of course, there are many ex-junta winners, who've later been elected, who are in the African Union. But I do think that there's some ideas to consider that might be implemented, but obviously real care has to be done in how that's defined. I'm really more with Fernando in terms of how to approach this from a criminal standpoint. and I think about January 6th, and you may remember that one of the most significant charges filed against these defendants, amongst many of them were found guilty of it, they also were found guilty, fortunately, of some other crimes as well, was interference with an official process, official proceedings. And of course they had. That's what they were doing. They were going to count up the votes and determine who got 270 and who was president of the United States, and they were doing everything they could, under Donald's suggestion from the ellipse, to prevent that from happening, and to keep Pence from actually declaring Biden the winner. And so they were convicted of that. Of course, as you may know, our Supreme Court narrowed that and has said that those official proceedings, they went against their usual textual rules, were really judicial proceedings. That's where it was in the code, and if you interfered with the judicial proceeding, but just the process of counting votes and deciding who's the chief magistrate, the executive of the United States of America, is not an official proceeding. So somehow our court wrote that out of the law. Finally, I think one still has to look at what these sorts of acts of corruption of democracy lead to, and how they might be foreseeable, and how they might cross the criminal threshold in terms of what's done, and then the ways in which people could be responsible for that. And I'm reminded of a movie I saw when I was 12 years old, Judgment at Nuremberg, which I don't think maybe you can find on cable these days. It's not about the great trial with Robert Jackson, the one of the Goering and everybody. It's actually the judge's trial. The United States and other parties against Allstatter and others, and that's dramatized there with Spencer Tracy playing one of the judges. But I'm reminded of the last scene, which really takes you. Because despite a dissent, Spencer Tracy has held on and convicted these judges because of the ways in which they corrupted the rule of law in Germany and essentially legalized mass persecution. And one of the leading defendants asked to see him before he leaves Nuremberg, and he wants to tell the judge, you did the right thing, I'm guilty. But you need to understand, we never thought there would be all those killings. To which Spencer Tracy said, well, you made it happen once you convicted an innocent man. And so if a system is corrupted and begins to lead to ways in which the innocent are locked up and their liberty is deprived, you have them participating in a plan to deny a human right. And if that is part of a widespread and systematic attack against the civilian population, give me the case and we'll charge it as a crime against humanity. Thank you.
Right, well, I suppose a crime against democracy would be a little like aggression. It would have to be a high-level crime. It would only be committed by a leader. And I think we need to look at the two possibilities. The one is domestic law, dealing with it, and it may be interesting, Reid, to get your view as to whether impeachment isn't in fact similar to the idea of a crime against democracy. That's at the local level. And would it be of any use if international law at the international level recognised a crime against democracy as an international crime?
Thank you, Richard. Well, certainly, in the U.S. context, I think the Founding Fathers assumed that if somebody did what Donald Trump was doing today, he would be impeached, because Congress would stand up and say, wait, you're trampling on our authority. Unfortunately, I think the Founding Fathers, one of their main misjudgments was they didn't see the rise of political parties, and they didn't see the rise of a totally controlled political party. So that it's not when you have one party that controls with an iron fist the Congress, then Congress people are no longer acting to protect their rights. They're acting to support their leader. I think there are back in the old days when I joined the International Commission of Jurists, Neil McDermott had put out these reports about human rights in one-party states. and how you could protect human rights in one party state. I mean, democracy is not, as Geoffrey said this morning, I mean, it's not in the documents. I mean, the right to participate in governance is a right. But you know, the UN has been, I think, very you know, broad-minded in not wanting to prescribe a particular form of government as the correct form. I mean, you have monarchies. You have, I mean, I am now the UN, I'm part of this UN Commission of Inquiry on Nicaragua. I've spent the last month, despite what you just heard 10 minutes ago, I've actually spent much of the last month talking about how democracy is being destroyed in Nicaragua. They now have a constitution in Nicaragua that creates a male co-president and a female co-president, so that Daniel Ortega's wife can be president, co-president, and they have reduced all the other organs of government they've reduced them from powers to organs to be coordinated by the presidency. And obviously, Nicaragua is getting trashed at the Human Rights Council for these kinds of things, but they don't really care as long as they got Russia and Venezuela and China on their side. I think these are unfortunately probably more questions of diplomacy and the like than they are of laws, of criminal laws, unfortunately.
Another idea. In 1990, we have had once of so many rigged elections in Tunisia, and at the time I was head of the Tunisian Human Rights League, and we thought we don't have a constitutional court, to challenge the fact that rigged elections, etc. And then I thought, let's try to imagine an international constitutional court, and let's imagine that this body exists, and then we Tunisian, because we don't have a constitutional court, we go to this international constitutional court, and maybe it's just we are imagining a new world, of course, that this international constitutional court say, hey, this election is rigged, we are not going to recognize the international community wouldn't accept this rigged election, etc., etc. And when I was elected in Tunisia, I thought it's probably the moment now to try to see, is that possible? And I remember I talked to the General Secretary, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, and he was interested by the idea, but he told me, look, it would take you maybe a few decades, before you can have something like this. And I said, well, why not? It took more than 3 or 4 decades, to have the ICC. So let's think about it. And I think, really, I do think that maybe we should think about this dream. It's a dream, of course, to have an international constitutional court, and because this could be also a way of defending democracy where it can be threatened as everywhere.
Any further thoughts? We've got about 8 or 9 minutes. Fernando?
Yeah, I wanted to share a couple of thoughts. I think that when in this erosion of democracy, destruction of democracy in the United States or in many countries, I think there is an indicator that beyond freedom of expression, it's clear to me, I don't know if there is science behind it or research, maybe there is, that is when the system doesn't protect anymore, doesn't authorize or allow or protect dissent. And for me, that's critical. When there is a democratic system should protect and allow a space for dissent, even to challenge the status quo, even to criticize power, even to challenge. And that needs to be protected as a fundamental pillar for democracy. When you smash that, don't authorize that, or criminalize that, for me it's a flag. Because you can still play with the freedom of expression, but when the dissent disappears or go to exile, or I think that's when, or there is an ambiance of fear that I think is happening in the United States. I live in the United States, and I think this fear of, may I say no, my job is at risk, my family, my studies, and that is really incredible. I think that's an indicator, and I think with the international community, which is usually defined by every other country but mine, right? The international community's definition is when it needs to protect and support spaces for dissent. And if it cannot happen in the country, they should happen outside the country, and they should be powerful, and the platforms and the voices should be very, very loud. And another related thought is that I think democracy collapses not by a person, but through a system. And I think that what, to me, this US election also made me really, really sleepless for a few times. It's not about Donald Trump anymore. It's about the system that is created around him, that I think it outlived him. It will outlive him in the future, and then this corruption and state is co-opted, taken. And that will be very difficult to dismantle in the future. And that is where it takes to the transitional justice. In the work that I've been doing for decades on countries in transition, I think that criminal prosecution is key, because it sends a signal that impunity is not allowed, that there is a limit in the criminality that you can accept, but the imprisonment of just condemn, the sentencing just one person wouldn't solve the problem if the system is not dismantled somehow. And we've spoken about the systemic corruption, how to address that. We talk about all those who played a role to a level of responsibility that they cannot claim command responsibility, even in public service, administrative service. How do you reform all that system before going into before the state starts delivering again, right? Just one example. We're talking now about Syria transition, where we are heavily involved, and we talk, and people is like, well, and Syrians say, like, our tribunals will deal with this. It's like, probably not. Probably your tribunals are not ready, equipped, no, and they are not independent enough. I remember in Tunisia the discussions about creating a constitutional court and how difficult it was to try to reform the justice system, which never happened. And those things cannot put the expectations to national systems until they are ready. And I think that is the international community support, to support that capacity building and also addressing from an international perspective at some level.
Thank you, Robert. Before concluding, Geoffrey, are there any further remarks?
Well, I think that although we were summoned to consider the crime against democracy, and Stephen is leading some panel tomorrow on drafting, I'm afraid I don't think it will work. Partly because it will be too vague, partly because it can be used to prosecute the wrong people, and I think we must just protect these elements of democracy, the ballot, to ensure that it's not rigged, and it may be that there is the case for an international crime of ballot rigging, protect freedom of speech, of course, and to give special protection to judges. So there are various crimes of bribing a judge, but there's no crime as such of the government or the Prime Minister or whoever telling a judge what to decide. So it may be that in that specific area, which is so important, that could be made a crime.
Well, so thank you very much indeed to our wonderful panel, and thank you very much to the audience for joining us. And with that, we'll bring this session to a close.
Thank you, Richard.